It is the spring of 1937 in Sumter County, Alabama, 6 miles northeast of the town of Livingston, and a woman named Emma Crockett is sitting on the top step of her own front hall. The hall is roofed and open at both ends. It is part of a small 2-room log house she has lived in for years, and it is the kind of house her neighbors call a dog trot. She is about 80 years old. She was born into slavery on a plantation a few miles from where she now lives, and she has been free for 72 of those 80 years. The interviewer sitting across from her, taking down her words on a pad of yellow paper, is a folklorist named Ruby Pickens Tart. Tart is working for the Federal Writers Project, the New Deal program that between 1936 and 1938 sent field workers across 17 states to record the testimony of more than 2,000 formerly enslaved Americans before they died. The interview is preserved in the Library of Congress collection Born in Slavery. Emma Crockett's photograph, taken on the same visit, is preserved with it. The caption reads simply, Emma Crockett's house. In the photograph, Emma sits on the front step of the dog trot. The hall is behind her. You can see straight through the house. The boards on the roof of the hall are pine, hand-rived from blocks of pine wood, split with a froe, not sawn. There are 2 rooms, one on either side of the hall, each with its own end-wall chimney. There are no walls between Emma and the front yard, and no walls between the hall and the backyard. The dog trot is open at both ends, and on the day Tart visited, the wind was running through it. By the time the photograph was taken, Emma had already done what every dog trot living Southerner had done on hundreds of August nights. She had dragged a thin mattress out of one of the 2 rooms and laid it on the floorboards of the hall, and she had slept there with the wind moving across her because the rooms inside the house were too hot to bear until midnight. This is not a metaphor. They were sleeping in the hallway because the hallway was the only cool place left. The house Emma Crockett lived in had a name that no architect had given it and that no deed mentioned. Her neighbors called it a dog trot. Some of them called it a dog run. A few of the older men still called it a possum trot, after a folk story about which animal first claimed the cool spot in the middle. None of those names made it into the property records. The records called it simply a dwelling, log, 2 pens. Tart, the folklorist, described what she saw with the precision of a person who knew she was documenting a vanishing form. The 2 rooms of Emma's house were of the type that the Encyclopedia of Alabama, drawing on decades of state folk building surveys, identifies as the dominant dwelling type of the upland and Black Belt South for most of the 19th century. Connecting the 2 rooms, in Tart's words, was an open hall roofed with heavy boards rived from pine blocks. The hall was a structural element of the house. It had a roof, it had a floor, it did not have walls. Tart added a sentence that captures the form's essential character. Many similar houses in the surrounding counties, she wrote, had no roof for the hall and no floor either, the hall being made entirely of earth, sky, and imagination. Stand on the dirt road in front of Emma's house at sunset. What you see is a low rectangle, maybe 40 feet wide, 1.5 stories tall. There's a stone chimney at each end. The roof is one continuous gable. The wood shingles have weathered to the color of dry pine bark. Between the 2 ends of the house is a dark slot. You can see straight through the house. Light from the backyard comes through the front. The slot is the breezeway. The Mississippi Encyclopedia ranks this form as the second most common type of house on the southern frontier in the 19th century, second only to the single 1-room cabin from which it grew. From Tennessee through Kentucky, through the hills of Mississippi, and into the cedar breaks of central Texas, the same form appeared and reappeared with small variations. 2 rooms, or pens, with a chimney at each end, joined under one long roof, with an open hall between. The American word for what Emma Crockett was doing in that hall on hot nights did not exist yet. The phrase air conditioning would not be coined for another 20 years. The folklife scholar Howard W. Marshall, writing for the Smithsonian in 1980 after years of interviews with the last generation of Southerners who had grown up in these houses, called the dog Trots' central hall a perfect air conditioning system. It ran on no electricity. It ran on no machinery. It ran on the wind that was already there. In wind tunnel experiments at Mississippi State University, scaled models of dog trot houses placed in moving air showed something that surprised even the engineers running the test. The air moving through the central hall was faster than the air moving past the outside of the house. The hall was not just letting the breeze through, it was accelerating it. The houses were not built by engineers, they were built by farmers. The men who first set the logs of the dog trot type in the early 1800s did not know the principle that the Swiss mathematician Daniel Bernoulli had described in his Hydrodynamica in 1738. They knew that when wind passed through a narrow gap, it sped up. They had felt it themselves on hot afternoons. They built houses that put the gap where they needed the wind. Walk up to Emma Crockett's porch. Step across the threshold. You are not inside yet. You are in the hall. The hall is roofed and floored and open at both ends. The floorboards are heart pine. Above your head, the underside of the roof is exposed. You can see the rafters, the purlins, the rived boards Tart described. There are no walls between you and the front yard, and no walls between you and the backyard. To your left and right are the doorways into the two pens that make up the house. Each pen, in the typical dog trot, was roughly 20 feet square. The dimensions match what historians of Tennessee log buildings have documented across hundreds of structures. Single pens of 18 to 20 feet on a side, doubled in dog trots, with a passage of 8 to 12 feet between them. The walls were horizontal logs, half dovetailed at the corners. The chinking, the clay and straw mortar that filled the gaps between logs, had to be repacked every spring. One pen was the cooking pen. It contained a hearth wide enough to roast a whole hog, a long work table, a churn, a row of crocks against one wall, and a ladder up to a sleeping loft above. There was no separate kitchen. The cooking and the eating happened in the same room. The other pen was the sleeping pen. One bed against the back wall, a trundle pulled out beneath it for the children, a wooden chest, a small mirror, a second ladder up to a second loft, two windows, both with shutters but no glass. The wind that ran through the breezeway did not curve around corners. It went through the hall and out the back. A person standing in the sleeping pen at 4 p.m. in August felt nothing. This was the central problem the dog trot solved, and the central problem it did not solve. The breezeway was brilliant. The rooms beside the breezeway were not. They were hot in summer and cold in winter. The chimney in each room could warm the air immediately around the hearth, but the room itself, made of logs with clay chinking, leaked heat in every direction. The hallway, in winter, became useless. The wind that cooled the family in August would freeze them in January. By Christmas, the breezeway was a place to walk through, not a place to sit. By February, snow blew across the floorboards. The same architectural feature that defined the house, the open hall, was for half the year an asset that had turned into an obstacle. This is one reason the dog trot, over time, would not survive. At Mississippi State University, engineers built a small wooden model of a dog trot house, fitted it with a row of tiny anemometers, instruments that measure wind speed, and placed the model in a wind tunnel. The model was oriented north to south, the way most dog trots in the upland south had been built, corridor running with the prevailing wind, porch on the south side. The tunnel was set to a moderate speed. The anemometers in the breezeway began to spin. Within seconds, they were spinning faster than the anemometers measuring the wind outside the model. The breezeway was accelerating the wind. The students ran the experiment again, and the result held. Experiment confirmed, in the dry language of fluid dynamics, is what Emma Crockett and her neighbors had known empirically for 90 years. When wind enters a narrowing channel, it accelerates. The breezeway of a dog trot is, structurally, a venturi tube. The roof on top, the two pens on the sides, the channel between. Together they narrow the wind's available path, and the air must move faster to conserve its mass. This is the same principle that lifts the wing of an airplane and sucks the curtain into a slightly opened window. There were other mechanisms at work, none of them articulated in physics terms until the late 20th century. All of them understood at a body level by the people who built and lived in the houses. The roof shaded the floor of the hall. The house sat on stone piers, raising the floor above damp ground so air could move under the floorboards as well as over them. Heat rising through gaps in the roof drew more cool air up from below. In Marshall's published Smithsonian fieldwork, an upland Tennessee farmer named Mr. Shellhorse told the folklorist that his old log dog trot, the one he had grown up in, was cooler in August than the modern frame house his son had built him with electric fans in every room. Cooler. He was speaking to a researcher with a notebook. He was describing a house that no longer existed except in his memory. He insisted on it. This is not an argument for the romance of pre-electric life. It is the testimony of a man who had lived under both regimes and had a preference. He preferred the house that did not need to be plugged in. Returned to Sumter County, Alabama in the spring of 1937, Emma Crockett is sitting on the top step of her dog trot talking to Ruby Pickens Tart. Tart records the moment in a sentence that survives in the published narratives. Emma settled herself on the top step at the front of the hall to talk to me after first ironing a tiny wrinkle out of her string apron with her hand. Picture the hall as Tart saw it. The pine floorboards are smoothed by 60 years of feet. The breeze is moving through. There's a chair on the porch and a string apron on Emma's lap. Behind her, through the open hall, you can see the backyard, the smokehouse, the well. The two pens of the house, one on either side, are in shadow. The hall is the lit room of the house in the middle of the afternoon. The hall is also where every transition happens, from yard to kitchen, from sleeping pen to cooking pen, from the front porch to the back garden. People walk through the hall constantly, and over the course of a day in summer, it becomes the room where the work spreads out. Peas to be shelled, quilts to be beaten, dough to be rolled. This was the part of the dog trot that was invisible in postcards and tourism brochures of later years. The breezeway was romantic in photographs because it was empty. It was empty because the work that filled the rest of the house had been concentrated into it by hand. Marshall's fieldwork, the WPA narratives, and a 1995 community study at the University of Mississippi that mapped a single small Mississippi town's dog trots against 100 years of birth and death and probate records all converge on the same finding. The breezeway worked because somebody, every day, kept the rest of the house from collapsing into chaos. That somebody, in a yeoman household, was the wife. In a tenant household, also the wife. In an enslaved household, an enslaved woman, often the mother, sometimes the grandmother, sometimes a girl of 12. The breezeway was air. The work that produced the breeze was bodies. Emma Crockett's testimony begins, like most WPA narratives, with the place of her birth. She was born into slavery on a plantation in Sumter County, Alabama. She was about 8 years old when emancipation came in 1865. The cabin she grew up in those 8 years, was not the dog trot Tart photographed her in. The dog trot was the house she came to live in as a free woman. The cabin of her childhood was something else. The WPA narratives collected in the 1930s and preserved in the Library of Congress give the architectural fact of slave housing in the Cotton South in plain words. Former enslaved people from Alabama described log cabins with dirt floors, built in 2 long rows behind the big house, beds nailed to the wall, mattresses of corn shucks and pine straw. Former enslaved people from North Carolina described cabins built of poles with stick and clay chimneys, 1 door, 1 small window at the back, single pen, sometimes double pen. Some had floors, some had only earth. In some cases, on some plantations, those quarters cabins shared the dog trot plan, 2 pens with a roofed open hall between. The Historic American Building Survey, the federal program that documented vernacular American architecture during the New Deal, photographed dog trot slave quarters at Thornhill Plantation in Greene County, Alabama in 1934. The cabins are double-pen log structures with central open passages standing in a row behind the main house. They look, in plan, like the houses upland yeomen built for themselves 100 miles north. They are not the same buildings. They are the same shape on different ground. In the cooking pen of a slave quarter cabin in the cotton country, the floor was dirt. Marshall's fieldwork and the WPA narratives both record an extraordinary fact about those floors. The women swept them. They swept them every day. They swept them so often with corn shuck brooms that the dirt compacted to a hardness like clay tile and developed a faint gray-white patina from the dust of constant motion. Former slaves' WPA testimony describes the floors as having been kept clean and white. The work was real. The white was not paint. It was sweeping. The Encyclopedia of Alabama makes the distinction at the state level. In the upland counties, the dog trot was the dominant house of independent white subsistence farmers. In the plantation lowlands, the same form, when it appeared, served as the upgraded version of the slave cabin, reserved for plantations where the owner could afford to build it or where the labor force was large enough to justify 2 pens. The plan was the same, the breeze was the same, the position of the house inside the social order was not. At Old Alabama Town, a historic buildings museum in Montgomery, the entrance to the working-class exhibit block runs through a structure called the Yancey Dog Trot. Visitors walk straight through the breezeway as their first physical experience of the museum. They are walking through the same kind of hall that, on the cotton plantations of the Black Belt, held the daily lives of women in the cabin rows behind the big house. Most visitors do not know this. They know what the museum sign says. In 2013, a graduate student at the University of New Orleans submitted a master's thesis on a category of buildings most New Orleanians had never noticed and most architectural historians had never counted: surviving dog trot houses inside the city limits. The fieldwork found 16 of them. 16 dog trots in New Orleans, most of them in the older Faubourg neighborhoods, most of them obscured by ironwork or by later additions, almost all of them with their breezeways enclosed sometime between 1890 and 1940. From the street, they looked like every other shotgun-adjacent house in the row. From the inside, the bones were unmistakable. A bay where a hall used to run, floor levels that did not match, rafter framing that had once spanned an open passage. The dog trot, in other words, was not just a frontier house. It had moved into the city. It had been pressed into the narrow lots of 19th century New Orleans and continued to do its work. The form traveled. It adapted. It worked in cities. It worked when it was hidden inside the walls of houses that no longer looked like dog trots. The reason most of those 16 New Orleans dog trots had had their breezeways closed in by the early 20th century is the reason most upland dog trots eventually had theirs closed in too. The reason was not that the breezeway stopped working. It worked. Mr. Shellhorse, talking to Howard Marshall in the 1970s, was still insisting it worked. The reason was electricity. By the 1930s, the Rural Electrification Administration was running poles into the back roads of the South. By the late 1940s, most farms in upland Alabama had power. By the 1950s, the first window unit air conditioners were on sale. The window unit changed the math. The breezeway had always cost something. Open hole in the middle of the house that wind blew through. In winter, that wind was freezing. A family that closed in the breezeway gained an extra room, a hall with walls and a door, for the price of giving up the August cooling. The window unit recovered the August cooling. It did so in a way that was steady, mechanical, controllable, It did not depend on which way the wind was blowing. It did not depend on whether the woman of the house had swept the breezeway floor. It worked on rainy afternoons when there was no breeze at all. It also worked in the bedroom, which was the room the breezeway had never reached. Across the upland South in the late 1940s and through the 1950s, the same change happened to thousands of dog trots. State folk building surveys in Alabama and Mississippi document the pattern in measured drawings and photographs. Tongue and groove boards laid across the open ends of the breezeway, doors framed at front and back, a single window installed in each new wall. By the end of the week, the hall was a hallway. The wind no longer ran through it. The wood floor was the same wood floor. The doors to the two pens were the same doors. The view from the front porch no longer went through the house. People closed the hall because, with the new window unit installed in the bedroom, they no longer needed the breeze. They also did it because their neighbors were doing it. The hall, by the late 1950s, had come to symbolize the past. It was what poor people had. The closed-in hall was what modern people had. The breezeway disappeared when its primary function, the moving of cool air through the house, was replaced by a machine. The labor that had once made the breezeway livable, however, did not get replaced by a machine. It just stopped being necessary in the same form. Emma Crockett, in her dog trot in Sumter County in 1937, swept the breezeway floor twice a day. The vacuum cleaner, when it came, replaced one specific motion of one specific tool. Indoor plumbing replaced the hauling of water. Gas and electric heat replaced the hauling of firewood. A stove replaced the open hearth. Each substitution saved time. The total time spent on household labor did not, in the studies that have been done, fall by anything like the percentages those substitutions might suggest. The standards rose, the labor stayed. What the dog trot's decline tells us is not that women's lives got radically easier. It tells us that the architecture of women's lives got moved indoors and behind walls. The work that had once been visible through an open breezeway now happened in a kitchen with the door closed. The kitchen had a window unit humming in it. The work was still real. The neighbors no longer saw it. The John Looney House stands on a low rise in St. Clair County, Alabama. It is a two-story log dog trot built around 1820, more than 200 years ago, one of the oldest surviving examples of the form in the state. It is now a museum listed on the National Register of Historic Places, maintained by a local historical society that opens it to the public on weekends. The breezeway at the Looney House is open at both ends, the way it has been since the 1820s. Stand inside it on a hot August afternoon, and the air moves across your face the way it moved across Emma Crockett on her step in Sumter County 100 years ago. The wood ages, the chinking ages, the wind does what it has always done. The Looney House was saved because it had been associated for 2 centuries with one prominent named family of independent farmers. Most dog trots that survived to be saved were saved on those grounds. The family was prominent, the building was old, the records were intact. The dog trots that did not survive, the cabins photographed at Thornhill in 1934, the slave quarters across the Black Belt, the hundreds of small upland dog trots whose owners were tenant farmers without the resources to maintain them, generally did not have those grounds. They burned or were torn down or rotted into the ground. Their wood went into other buildings. Their stones went into other foundations. Their breezeways went nowhere at all, because they had never been thought of as worth saving. A person who visits a preserved dog trot today and is told the romance of pioneer. Ingenuity is being told something true. The pioneer ingenuity was real. The breeze in the hall is real. What that visitor does not see is what also stood in the same plan in the cabin rows behind the big houses with the same breeze and a different story underneath. By the 1980s, the dominant new house in the South was a ranch, single-story, central air, 2-car garage, kitchen with a microwave, a dining room with a chandelier, and running through the middle of it, a hallway. The hallway connected the front door to the back patio. There were bedrooms on one side and a living room on the other. The hallway was fully enclosed. There was wood floor underfoot and sheetrock walls on either side, and recessed lights in the ceiling. There was a thermostat on the wall set to 72 degrees. The plan is, in its essential geometry, the great-great-grandchild of the dog trot. 2 zones of rooms, one on each side, joined by a central circulation. The differences are everything. The hallway is not open at the ends. The wind does not move through it. The wind is no longer needed. The thermostat is needed. Emma Crockett did not live to see a ranch house. She died sometime after Tart photographed her. The house in the photograph stood for some years afterward, then weathered, then was either pulled down or absorbed into a later structure, like most dog trots in Sumter County. The Library of Congress preserves the image. The Federal Writers Project preserves her words. The wind that ran through her hall in 1937 still runs across the same patch of ground in Alabama, but there is no hall there for it to accelerate now. The breeze moved through the hall. The family slept in it. They did this because the alternative was the heat of the rooms. The empty hallway in the ranch house is the same hallway. The door at one end is closed.